Hey, busy 505 teams, PV here with good news, the last video you'll ever have to watch with me. Bad news, we still got to do the final, but I'm hoping, even though it will be a difficult process, I'm hoping it'll be a very rewarding one because you have laid the foundation. You've done the hard work that is required for a successful final, and that's all that individual research you've done and all those team meetings you've had. That is the work you needed to do so that you are well positioned for this final. And you also practiced it once. The midterm that you did was a very similar process of taking all that disparate information and creating a narrative. It's a slightly different focus in the final. I would call the beginning really a setting of the stage, right? It could be anything in the world that we might have focused on, and here's what we decided to focus on. And then this strategic framework on this side, I would call that your vision. So explain the current situation and explain where you're going to go. And that's very similar to what the midterm was, just slightly different focus here. And also note, you might have a short setting of the stage and a bigger vision for the future, or you might have a longer setting of the stage. These are not prescribed lengths or prescribed weights. One of your themes, for example, could be really fat and deep, and another theme could be skinny and light. You might have 2 themes or 4 themes. I am hopeful that your team is able to come together and end up with an overarching thesis that ties it together. And that speaks to the team vision that is the holy grail of this class, frankly. And not every team gets there. It really depends on how much of the work, how much research, how many team meetings, if you've created the culture where you can come together, because organizing all that stuff that you've done into this framework requires that team voice. That's where we're headed in these last 2 weeks. And we have time to do it. I'm excited you've done all that work in the past, and we've got almost 2 full weeks to work on this to finish your presentations. Another way of saying team voice is shared vision. And a little history lesson, when I first taught this class, Pat Garner and I co-taught it. Pat was a former Coca-Cola executive. He was on the original Diet Coke team who launched Diet Coke. And he brought this used to be one of our textbooks. So you're lucky we don't have textbooks anymore. But it was one of the disciplines, actually the first discipline of these 5 disciplines is this one. I'll let you read it. And I bet you this looks a lot like what I say when I come to your study room and I say, I want you to pitch this to your grandmother. I want you to believe the things you're saying. I don't want you to be in compliance. And that requires that your team has gotten past divide and conquer. I hope you've put in the work that it takes to trust each other, to challenge your ideas. And I don't mean in an argumentative or a debative way. I mean to think everything through. And I'm going to give you a practical exercise to do that here shortly. From lecture 1, I pointed out that I don't want to come to your study room and ask, have you done this, this, and this? And you tell me, yeah, we did this, and we did this. I want to come in and find out, well, we started doing this, and then we went into this, and then we did this, and now we're trying to figure out this. I want an exploratory, open process. And so this is where you are for your final. You should not be too rigid. You should not be set. You should still be trying to figure out, as a team, how do we get to that team vision? And that requires deep, open team discussions. I'll also use the word along. You may remember one of the pieces of feedback I get about this class is that it is labor intensive. It is a heavy workload. So that might be what we're talking about going into this final. That workload is a lot of hours sometimes, but hopefully they're very rewarding because you're doing really deep, smart stuff. So let me give you 2 quick suggestions of how you might organize your time and or your presentation. This one's kind of a quick one for the presentation. You've seen this funnel a number of times in this class. We use it to set the stage. It could be anything broadly, and it goes to here. It's kind of a macro to micro funnel, if you will. But it also works within each theme. As you set up themes, set the stage for each theme. Don't just launch in with specific data points or specific research that you found. What is the theme? How do we set that up? And then what are the specific findings? So remember that funnel throughout your presentation. And then secondly, maybe more importantly, this might be useful for your team discussions. And this is an exercise I want to say we did in the 2nd or 3rd class where we talked about ideas and how big they are. And really any idea could be any of these 3. And what I think might help your team discussions, if you take any of your findings and put them in, put it right here, best finding or 1 finding, make it a medium finding. And this is, you'll unpack it here and you'll put it into context here. So as a team, this is a discussion, and it should be a robust, open discussion. Here's the finding, and I'm just going to use the word pricing, which is, I'm not looking for one-word findings. Every team's going to have different findings, so I just want to do some broad strokes here. A discussion about what we think we found about pricing, and then a discussion about what is the context of pricing for us. Why are we talking about pricing? What's the broader picture? And I'll just say marketing here is, again, I'm not looking for one-word answers. But that might be the broader context. Whatever it is for your team, you should have your own language around that. And you might have, competitor does blank, Jim said blank, or people are saying blank, whatever it is in terms of the research that you have that supports the findings that might be underpricing. And then you might also, what is the other context? You might use the other 4 Ps in this particular example. What is it, product or place or promotion? So if your team thinks about all of your any of your ideas and has a conversation like this, I think you will start to, as a team, evolve in your understanding of what you have. And that will help your presentation, help you find a shared vision, because you will have thought about everything. They're not right answers when you think about everything. It's tricky. So it's not a point of, your goal is not to find right answers. Your goal is to think it through and have a more evolved understanding so that you'll have a shared vision. So use that context / unpacking that big, medium, small exercise for your conversations, and that might help. Those are really debatable. So those could be, tons of iterations and big discussions. It could take hours. Be ready for that and be open to that and enjoy that process, because that is a normal strategic process. Strategy, having a super smart, well-informed strategy is hard work. So be prepared that takes time. And if you're trying to just bang this out, you may not get to that shared vision, holy grail that I'm hoping your team can reach to. The last thing I want to do is I want to take you down memory lane here. I want to show you the video that you watched to enter into this class when I was kind of asking you to drop it if this is not the right class for you. So watch that video real quick, and on the back side of that, I'll say a few words. Hey, BUSI 505 students, Patrick Vernon here, PV, be your professor for the semester. And I wanted to do a quick video to make sure BUSI 505 fits your expectations. To start, the title of the class is a little confusing because, frankly, it's kind of not a thing. Entrepreneurial consulting is not really a career path per se. There's sort of 2 different things, a little bit of oil and water with entrepreneurship and consulting. If you think about it, when you think of consulting, it's a perfect fit at the business school, high-level strategic thinking, macro level, well-educated, like you can see, corporate smart folks in airplanes flying around thinking high-level strategy. When you think about entrepreneurship, it's a little more like the maverick, building a company one customer at a time, very involved, very passionate. They're not completely different. They have a lot of things in common, in fact, and these are things that are in common with this class as well. First and foremost, they're strategic thinkers. This is a strategy class, and we'll have a big strategic problem to be working on, and both founders and consultants have to use frameworks so that they can come up with a persuasive narrative about what they're going to do in this complicated strategic scenario. And to do that, we incorporate everything from the business curriculum. So you need to bring everything you've learned from core curriculum classes, and we've got to figure out a way to infuse those into a strategy. Our big project for this class is to find a growth strategy for a startup. So we're going to be, just like consultants and just like founders, utilizing these other buckets here, frameworks, persuasive narratives, using the entire curriculum. One extra challenge for business school students is translating what I will call corporate speak into startup speak. We've got to take things that we've learned in our classes, which are really designed for Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 businesses, and translate those into sort of the startup ecosystem, if you will. And that's a big challenge for a lot of business school students. And so just keep that in mind. It's not consulting, but it's not really management consulting. We're not talking Fortune 500 here. We're talking startup. And just as an example, if you look over here, I know segmentation, a lot of business school students would think, millennials is a segment. Well, millennials is not a segment to startups. That's a whole market. A segment to startups is more like a micro niche as you're building your company one by one. Say sophomores at state universities, that would be a niche. How are we going to do this? It's going to be experiential education. You're probably aware that you get EE credit for this class. And the way we're going to do it is a little simulation where you're going to play the startup team. You'll pretend to be the founders of a startup. And like a Y Combinator accelerator, you've got a whole cohort of other startups in this class. So you put those together, and sort of like our BUSI 505 SimCity startup, with the caveat, this looks way more fun than it's going to be. It is a business school class, so it's not a video game. It's going to be a business school class, but we are going to run a simulation. And the game is, we'll find a startup and form teams around the startup. So once we've got teams together going out of that second week of class, you are the founding team. Obviously, the startup has its own founders, but what we will be doing in our SimCity is pretending that you are the founding team. That means you're saying we and not they. It's not their startup, it's your startup. What would you do next? That is your big strategic question for the entire semester long project. Find a growth strategy. That's your strategic project. And that by that, I mean, what would you do next if it were your startup? And if you look at all these things here, marketing, operations, communications, it could be any of those things. Maybe maybe they're communicating something poorly. Maybe they're not marketing the way you would market. It will depend on your team's core competencies, and it'll depend on how much you learn about the value network of your startup, what direction you go. But it will be up to your team to find that direction. And you'll hear me say a lot in this class, to find your voice as a team, as a startup team. You're the founding team. What would you do next? This is different than consulting in that we're not going to treat the startups as a client. So you don't have to try to decide what you think they would do next. You're going to try to do, if this were your startup, what would you do? So here's kind of a snapshot of what this class is sort of like, right? We are utilizing frameworks and creating narratives and using the whole curriculum in a simulation where you're the founding team. So that means it's maybe not the best for management consulting students who just want another consulting class. This is really focused on startups. I mean, it uses a lot of consulting stuff. So some students feel like BUSI 554 was really helpful because it helps them create narratives and use frameworks. Others find it was harmful because they're so locked into corporate speak, it's hard to translate into entrepreneurship. Ultimately, I'm hoping that you will leave this class with better tools to answer this question in case at some point in your career, one of your classmates or colleagues says, hey, you want to quit and join my startup? And you might even be that person. This test drive, this simulation we'll do in BUSI 505 will help you answer that question. So that gets us into specific learning outcomes of this class. There are 4 major buckets. And number 1 is learning how to juggle. And not just startups, obviously management teams and consulting teams have to juggle. There are too many, I mean, business school students have to juggle, right? But it is exaggerated on startup teams. And one thing that's different about startups is there's less control. You might be, as a founder, the captain of this hot air balloon, but it depends on which way the air blows, the wind blows. And that can really be, that doesn't fit everybody. Not everybody's up for that level of ambiguity. Some people thrive in it and some people do not. So that's one thing you'll learn in this class at this stage in your life. How much are you interested, for example, in the next year or two, taking on that level of ambiguity and that level of risk and unknown? Because the ups and downs in startups tend to be exaggerated, right? On the upside, you could become amazingly wealthy. And on the downside, you could go bankrupt. For the class, the ups are kind of similar in that you have autonomy and you're working on a real world project, so that this, things you do come up with could get implemented by your startup. I mean, you might even go work at the startup, who knows? It might even be your startup for that matter. There's high risk and return in these projects, but on the downside, it can be very frustrating for some students who are used to, of course, lectures and right and wrong answers. The word rudderlessness comes up a lot with students. They're not sure how to do this. And it is a heavy workload. So this is a microcosm of what it's like to be on a startup team. So that is why the class is structured in such a way. And I want you to notice that this downside piece can be really hard on some students, where you've been taught for years and years, if you make a mistake, that's a problem. So understand that it's not necessarily a problem. This is experiential education, and that is not sitting and learning, it's being actively involved. And that means, in part, it can be frustrating when not everything is going to be going up the whole time. The good news, there's no textbook, there are not very many lectures, but the bad news is your engagement is required. You got to really get actively involved in these projects. And part of that is that up and down thing, by the way, is handled a little bit by the lean process. If you've had any other startup classes or entrepreneurship classes, you've heard of lean startup. And I'll dumb it down to this simple concept, which is you have an idea or a hunch, or for lean startup, they often talk about a minimum viable product. You test it, and then you iterate based on the feedback that you get. And we will be doing that in our class in BUSI 505 with your ideas for growth strategies. We're going to test those and iterate those throughout the semester. And if you think about it, why do you iterate anything? You iterate because it's not right. There's something that needs to get corrected. And so you might think of this lean process as a cure for the downs. Iteration means, in other words, pivot, means you need to change something. It means something was wrong. And wrong is not wrong. Wrong is just a part of the process. Iteration is a part of the process, and that gets you to new, better hunches or new, better products, a new, better understanding of the world. Those are all good things. It's just kind of a hard process because you have to learn by doing. You hear the phrase fail fast and iterate, right? Do it quickly, learn as much as you can. Don't think of it as failure. It's moving forward. You sometimes hear it called fail forward. Not, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. You know, we thought that people were going to hate blank, and then we went out and talked to people and it turns out they love it, or the opposite. Both of those, you can't take it personally. It is a part of the process. Imagine if Edison failed at step number 1900 on the way to the light bulb. Like he's, you know, his attitude was, I never failed. It just took a long, long time and a lot of steps. Our class will be kind of like that. Sometimes it's going to feel like you failed, but understand that's just a part of the process. That's the part of the learning process. It's a part of the lean process. And once you get used to it, you start to have a better attitude about it and you're more productive, including when I come to your study room and I say, hey, did you think of this or did you think of that? And your team might be like, oh no, we made a mistake. You didn't make a mistake. You're in progress. It's a part of the process. And that process gets a bunch of data. What we're going to be doing all semester is accumulating data so that you can become better data analysts and learn to tell those stories. Your persuasive stories are most persuasive when you have data or evidence to support your arguments, and you incorporate those into your storyline, right? I would also maybe call this less BS. To some extent, corporate speak can sometimes, often to entrepreneurs and to venture capitalists, corporate speak sounds like BS because it's so high level and so broad, it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. We're really going to get into the weeds and get very specific. You're going to get your own quote unquote data. And a lot of times means talking to people, interviews. What did people say? That's a kind of data. We're not going to be working with huge spreadsheets of downloaded customer data or anything like that. We're going to go through this data collection process where you will be doing lots of interviews, for example, and I'll coach you through this process, but this will get you through. In the beginning, we've kind of got best guesses, and midterm was sort of have an early data indicates or the evidence seems to point to. And in the end, we'll have findings through this investigative process. Because you will be gathering the data, you will become a more compelling storyteller because it's something you actually believe in. I often tell students that, look, you're the founding team and pretend you're pitching this to your rich aunt or your grandfather, you know, somebody in your family or somebody in your personal network that might fund your startup for $100,000. You need to really believe the things you're saying, and you need to say them very convincingly and specifically. To do that, I think it helps if you think a little bit more like a journalist as opposed to what we normally do in the business school. We're going to be building on our business school skills, and we're going to be adding this level of entrepreneurship, if you will. So if you think about a journalist, they have a hunch or a story idea, and then they go interview a bunch of people, and then they iterate the story, and they report what the world said. Right? But that reporting came from their early hunch, iterated through their interviews. You'll go through that similar process, and it's very different than what we do for case studies, for example, or what we did in business communications, where you're given a problem. You kind of just come up with solutions based on what you've learned in classes and your experience, and then you create a beautiful PowerPoint coming, you know, supporting the hunches you had. I often call this study room strategy. And that's really important. And we're really good at that in the business school. But what we'll be adding to that in this class is you'll actually be going out and interviewing people, and you're not going to fall in love with your early hunches. Your study room hunches are kind of meaningless. They're just a beginning of the process. What you want to do is find out what is really happening in the world and report that back. So we're going to work like a lean journalist. We're going to have these early hunches. We're going to go interview people and understand what the industry and market look like. And we will have a story at the end. It's not lofty corporate speak that could be interpreted as BS. The last thing I want to talk about is a learning outcome from BUSI 505 as being a real team player. And maybe I should change that to being more like a founding or startup team player. In corporate America, we obviously divide and conquer. And of course, in all your classes, when you have teamwork, you divide and conquer. And to some extent, we'll do a little dividing and conquer in this class. But startup teams very much all do everything. They have positions to play and roles to play, but everybody's involved in each aspect of it. And I will require that of your team as well. You're not going to divide this project into different buckets and then slap it together and sort of glue it and MacGyver it together with super glue and duct tape at the end. You're all going to be involved in every aspect of the project. So really, at the end, each of you could individually give the final presentation. I could give the final presentation. We will all be so deeply involved in it. Through that process, you'll have a team vision and a team voice. You know, earlier I mentioned you're finding a growth strategy. You know, what would you do next? All three of you or four of you have to kind of come up with that vision together. And there can be some disagreement. And then, in fact, there should be, and that's this last bucket here. You need to trust each other enough. You need to be meeting often enough and having deep discussions. And in fact, I'm going to require that you meet outside of class every week. So there's no textbook, there's no outside reading, but there is a lot of outside work, including meeting every week, so that you get to a level you can trust each other to have conflict. Because if startup teams don't have conflict internally and work through those as a team, they're going to get beaten up in the markets. You can't take a product to market having not thought it all the way through. So we'll simulate that in BUSI 505. And the simulation in our case often is me coming to your study room and saying, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? And you, by the end of the semester, should be answering, oh yeah, we've thought about all that. We've talked about it. There's not always an answer. That can be a struggle for a lot of students. A lot of times, yeah, we've thought about it and there's no right answer. It might go this way or it might go that way. And startups work in that environment all the time where we don't know, but we have thought about it and we are prepared to iterate. Our current thinking is blank and we're prepared to iterate in case blank happens. You got to think through all those scenarios. This is about being on the founding team, not being a consultant to the founding team. So once again, in our SimCity simulation, you're going to be pretending to be the founding team. You're figuring out what you want to do next. And we're not doing client relationship kind of work here. So you'll actually only meet the client. You'll meet your startup founders about 5 weeks, 4 or 5, maybe 4 weeks into the class, and you don't meet them again until your final presentation. And that's by design. It seems counterintuitive, but it's by design. I keep you separated from them so that you can come up with your own strategy. And frankly, that means you're going to have better work for them because you're going to work harder on your own vision. That autonomy is really important. So think about these learning outcomes. They may not be perfect for you, if you were planning to be a management consultant and really not that interested in entrepreneurship. Also, I should share with you what is shared with me by former students. It is a heavy workload. I'm told it's not as bad as BUSI 554 consulting skills and frameworks, but similar. They often say it's worth it because it is a real life project. And so it really has a specific meaning and outcome that is worth it, which speaks to this middle bucket as well. There's something really tangible here to talk about in interviews. You are going to have some challenges. There are going to be some downs in BUSI 505 for you and your team. And that gives you a good fodder for interview materials, tangible things you can talk about. And lastly, and this maybe should be first because I get this a lot, is the most intense team experience. This is not one where you just divide and conquer and slap it together. As I've mentioned, everybody has to be engaged, have to be doing the homework week in and week out. This is not a class where you can let it build up and then make it happen at the end. Think about all of these things as you consider if you want to stay in 505. We may have people on the wait list, so it's helpful if you drop sooner than later. All right, team, so this is it. We are almost done. We do have one last class period on Tuesday. We'll come together and have a quick discussion about lessons learned. We also have some time during that. I'll have the study rooms. We will break out probably for part of that. But I do want to have a robust conversation because everybody gets a little something different. You're having a really robust, interesting, complex experience. And I want you to hear what your classmates are experiencing. Other teams have very different. I wish you could go like I do to every room and feel the different culture of the different teams in each room. It is fascinating. I hope you bring some of that to Tuesday's class. We'll be in our normal classroom Tuesday, last day of class for us. I'll also carve out time in that class period to do the course evaluation, and I'll ask that you wait until that class to do it so you can get a feel, I hope, a little more context around what you learned all semester. As we work in the home stretch here, hoping you find that team vision. All right, I'll see you Tuesday.